This week, we are in the third part of a series called Undisturbed. Undisturbed. Now, if this is your first week joining us, we're glad you're with us, but we'll catch you up a little bit. We started off by asking this question, kind of reflecting back on last year, 2021, which I'm sure was like everybody's best year ever, right? 2021, think about this. What we asked is, if you had to look back at everything that happened and really try to sum up the entire experience in one word, what would it be? What would it be? And so we asked on social media, on Instagram, and our Instagram story, we asked people to do that, just try and sum it up in one word. And if you're like most people, the word might not be super positive, you know? And we got words like difficult, hard, challenging, miserable, sad, like with just one negative thing after the next. And that's understandable. I probably would say the same thing. It was a really rough year, right? But here's what we've been talking about the past few weeks. 1 year from now, roughly, it's going to be 2023. And we're going to look back on the year 2022. Could you imagine if you look back at everything that happened, the ups and downs, the highs and lows, the things you were expecting and the things that you didn't, the things that you celebrated and the things that you couldn't stand? Could you imagine if you look back on that year and said, in spite of everything that happened, for me, internally, there was this sense of peace. In spite of what's going on. Like a calm in the midst of the storm. Peace. So we've kind of been wrestling with that for a little bit. And what we've said is like, okay, well, what would that even look like? You know? How do you get there? And really, what would you be willing to do? What would you be willing to give? What would you be willing to change to be able to say, you know what, 2022, for me, no matter what happened internally, there was this feeling of things like just right. And so we said, okay, well, if that's what we're going for, right, really what we have to think about is what do we mean? What do we mean by peace? How do you define peace? What I told you on week one, and I think on week two too, it was like for me, you know, when I think of peace, like just right, you know, I think of like a jar of peanut butter that hasn't been touched. You ever open a fresh jar of peanut butter and it's just so smooth on the top, right? Or you see my wife, Allie, she likes to watch this show on Netflix. It's called The Home Edit. Anybody seen that show? All right, so these ladies, they organize everything. What they do is they'll take like this bookcase that's all out of whack and there's books thrown everywhere and they take everything and they color code it. And I see it, my wife actually did that to our kids' books. I walked in, I was like, peace. Right, what's interesting is that that's actually not too far from the idea of peace as it's presented in the Bible. It has this idea of everything being just right. Complete. Whole. The way it's supposed to be. The ancient Hebrew word is this word shalom. Complete satisfaction. And so that's like kind of what would it take to get there. If you look up the word peace, you do a little research on your own, you know, you ask Siri or Google or whoever you at, Jeeves, remember him? The definition of peace, what you'll see over and over and over again is that it's often defined by what's not there, right? Like the lack of violence or the lack of war or freedom from, in fact, for us, the way we defined it, it's actually Google's #1 definition, is freedom from disturbance. It's where we got the title for the series, Undisturbed. Like internally, it's just right. And so then over the past couple weeks, we've been asking, what disturbs your peace? What are the things that disturb your peace. And maybe you've caught on a little bit if you've been with us for the past couple weeks. We've been talking about some really practical situations that disturb the peace, but beneath each one of those is something deeper that's actually disturbing the peace. So on week 1, we said pride. Pride disturbs your peace. And we define pride as ruthless, sleepless, unsmiling concentration on the self. Actually, we didn't define it that way. A guy named C.S. Lewis defined it that way. It is unsmiling. It is joyless. It robs you of your peace. It makes everything about you. And what's interesting is that when you let pride in, you push peace out. Pride and peace, they don't live well together. And so the things that these areas where I'm constantly working to build myself up, right? Remember the ladder? Really, it's not the situations that cause me to do that. It's the pride within me that is disturbing the peace of my life. And then last week, we talked about something called anger, something we're all probably familiar with, right? And at the core, at the heart of anger is really this belief that I'm not getting what I want, or this feeling that I'm not getting what I want. When I'm mistreated, when I'm disrespected, when I'm cut off in traffic, when things it's really an unmet desire that produces anger. It's not necessarily that I've been cut off in traffic. It's the anger within me that's disturbing the peace. Why? Because when you let anger in, you push the peace out. We looked at a passage written by a guy named James, right? And we basically picked it apart a little bit. He talked about being slow to anger and what anger produces. And we said, well, anger, because anger is the idea of not getting what we want. Anger is actually helpful for showing you what you want, but it will not get you what you want. And when you let anger in, you push peace out. And so if you want to catch up on those two, those are online. You can watch them or listen to them. This week, we're talking about something that is huge. It is one of, if not the greatest disturbance in the human heart. It wreaks all kinds of havoc. It breaks up all kinds of relationships. It's ruined marriages, friendships, careers. The biggest issue, though, is that it's deep beneath the surface. It's subtle. And when it shows itself, it often appears as something else. It can be the issue beneath the issue. And so we can spend our lives treating the symptom of this issue and never actually addressing the symptom itself. It can appear to be something noble. We could let this issue in and think that we're supposed to do it. And so we can approve of it. We can tolerate it. We can even leverage it ourselves. But nothing good comes from it. And so here's how I'll introduce it to you. Have you ever felt like no matter how much you do, you really should be doing more? Or no matter how far you've gotten, you really should be a little further. Or no matter how thin you are, you really should be a little bit thinner. No matter how high you've climbed on the corporate ladder, you really could be a little bit higher. Or this nagging feeling of, I just need to be a better fill in the blank. I just need to be a better husband. I just need to be a better wife. I just need to be a better parent. I need to be a better friend. I need to be a better student. And the standard kind of keeps moving with you. As you achieve, it just kind of seems to keep going further. And you may have made plenty of progress in whatever area you're talking about, but you still feel the same thing within you. I really should be further. It's this constant, unending belief that I am never enough. What we're talking about today is something called shame. Now, we've talked about this before, and if you've been with us for a long time, you think, oh, here we go again, right, with shame. But shame is huge. It's a huge huge issue. And this is one of those things that is so central to who we are as a church that it will continue to keep coming up over and over and over again. In fact, last March, we did an entire series on shame called Not Enough. But it's something where once you learn to identify shame in your life, in the life of others, in the life of the church, it's one of those things you literally can notice everywhere you go, in yourself and in others on a daily basis. It's toxic. It's toxic, and it's an assault on the identity. It's an assault on not like what I'm doing, but in who that makes me. It's an attack on the identity. And so when we talk about peace being disturbed, internal peace, it's too important to not bring up again. Because when you let shame in, you push peace out. The two don't work well together. If you were with us in March, we defined shame as this belief, this extremely painful belief that I am flawed, I have issues, I have mistakes. But that's not the painful part. It's where that leads us. It's I am flawed and therefore unworthy of being loved and accepted. Or some people would say love and belonging, or love and connection. Now, maybe you didn't wake up this morning like feeling like, I just like today want some love and acceptance, right? Like that's not usually the language that we use. Especially if you're a guy, this can sound like a little mushy. But boy, girl, male, female, like wherever you are and however you feel about these things, they are central to who we are as people. This feeling of needing to feel worth, love, and acceptance. I would suggest your most painful social experiences have been experiences when you felt unworthy of love and acceptance. Have you ever been rejected? Have you ever been dumped? Have you ever been cut from a team? Or fired? Or told you're just not good enough? These are all attacks on the identity. They're extremely painful. And so while we might not say, I crave love and accept, that's really what we crave. On the flip side, I would also suggest that your most satisfying and gratifying experiences have been experiences when you have felt love and acceptance, belonging, connection. Right? If you've ever gotten something you really wanted, if you've ever succeeded, if you've ever achieved a dream, if you ever hit a mark you were going for, if you've ever made the game-winning shot or hit the home run, right, the walk-off home run, or if you've ever made the huge sale that saved everything for the it's not necessarily the fact that your team won, right? It's not necessarily that your company's doing well. It's not necessarily what happened because of it. It's because of what I get from it, right? Like what that says about me. How that makes me feel loved and accepted. And so we need this as people. We crave this as people. And shame is the belief that because of my issues, the story of shame is the belief that because of my issues, I don't deserve this. And it's toxic. It's destructive. It doesn't work well with peace. It's this vague, foggy feeling of just not being enough. Not being enough. It's interesting. I'm like really into origin stories, right? I love knowing why someone is the way they are. That's what origin stories do. They tell us why someone is the way they are, right? Like Spider-Man. You know Spider-Man is Spider-Man because he got bit by a spider. It's like, okay, cool. That's why he can, do his thing. Batman. You know Batman, if you don't know Batman's story, he is the way he is because he watched his parents get killed. And so he decided to dedicate his life to, fighting crime and all this. And so we know why they are the way that they are because of their origin story, right? And in the Bible, in the first book of the Bible, in Genesis, we're actually given an origin story of the human race. You might be familiar with it. It's in Genesis 1, when God speaks everything into existence. Now, Some people think that this happened exactly as it's written. Some people don't. But no matter where you fall on that spectrum, just set that aside for a second. Try to take this for what it is. Here's what happens in the origin story. God speaks everything into existence. And he says, that's good. He's like happy with everything made. He's like, that's good, that's good, that's good. And when he's done, he celebrates over it. Like, this is really, really good. Really good. He creates the human race, right? Adam and Eve in his own image. And he's happy about it. And so it's a picture of paradise, of everything being just right, the way it's supposed to be. In fact, what some theologians call this picture of shalom, peace, just right. Now, I'm a real critical question asking person. I want to know. I want to know all the details. I want to know what's going on. And so I want to know, what's it like to be in paradise? What's it like to be a person in paradise, Like every day feel like a Friday? Are all the jokes funny, right? Is every stroke a hole in one? Do you make every shot that you take? Is everything nice? Are all women really easy to understand? Does everything always go? All these questions, what's going on in paradise? No taxes. What's paradise like? Well, at the end of this little origin story, we're given a summary statement, one thing about what it's like to be a human in that complete shalom, just right. And you know what we're told? We're told that Adam and his wife were both naked, and they felt no shame. Now, if you've heard that before, if you know this story, you're like, yeah, you finished it before we got there. Oh, yeah, they were naked, they felt no shame. I know, but just stop and think about that. Why? Why is that the one thing? There's a million other things that could have been told about them. Why? Why? It's this picture of, for us, relational paradise, shalom, peace. This picture of being fully seen and fully known. Not literally naked, but fully exposed and completely embraced, right? Of being seen and found to be worthy of, remember our definition? Love and acceptance. We crave that. And you know this, your best relationships can be described this way. When you're talking about your best friends, we say things like, oh yeah, I can be myself when I'm with them, right? They know the real me. It's this picture of exposure and acceptance, seen and loved, fully known and fully loved. But the issue, if you know the story, is that once shame sets in, everything gets messed up. Without going into the details of the story, there's a moment where things fall apart. What we call the fall. And if you're someone who likes to study this stuff, often we look back at this story, theologians look back, the church looks back at this story, and we describe it in terms of sin, right? You might know this as the story of original sin. And that's definitely true. That's definitely one of the themes. The Apostle Paul explains that later on. But if you were to read this story on its own, and the way the ancient audience understood this story on its own, it was a story that was completely and totally about shame. In fact, this word sin is not even in the story. And here's what happens. Once things fall apart, here are the effects right away. It says, then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they realized they were naked. They noticed their vulnerability. They became aware of their exposure. And so what do? They sew fig leaves together, and they make coverings for themselves. Coverings for themselves. From that point on, once shame enters the story, we begin this process of what people who are much smarter than me call identity curation or identity management. Meaning, before it was look, this is who I am, and I am completely loved and completely embraced, right? Fully known and fully loved. We go from there to all of a sudden, it's my job to prove that I am worthy of love and acceptance. And so I build this image, this model, this concept of me, how I want to be seen. I create this identity, and it's my job to create it, to manage it, and to protect it. And so shame binds us to a life of performing, pretending, and defending. I've got to work, I've got to perform, I've got to do, because I've got to prove my worth. And so this is why, we never feel like we've gotten far enough. We never feel like we've done enough. It's why moms feel like they have never done enough for their kids. It's why dads feel like they have never done enough for their families. It's why it seems like this standard just keeps moving. I've got to prove that I am worthy of love and acceptance, because my needs as a human being depend on that. And so we just keep going and going and going and fighting, never really arriving, never feeling like we've made it. Performance. And then what happens is, we blow it, right? We mess up because we're imperfect people, and that's the way it goes. But when your whole identity is built on the image that you're presenting to the world, we're forced to pretend. Right? That's where the covering comes in. And we see Adam and Eve do this. All of a sudden, they realize themselves, they become aware of themselves, and immediately they have to start covering up the parts that they don't want people to see. And so we've got to make it look like we're all together. We shift from vulnerability and authenticity to then faking it. Not being honest about who we are. Fearing what will happen if you see the real me. And from there, when that image, when that identity, when my worth comes under attack, I defend it. I've created my identity. I've managed my identity. Now I got to protect it. And we see this in the Genesis story too. As soon as their issue is addressed, they just start pointing the finger, defending their worth, defending their identity. All of this to prove that they're worth something. And out goes peace. This is exhausting. It's exhausting to have to continue to try and prove that you are worth love and acceptance. It's painful. The problem is not your flaw. The problem is not your issue. The problem is not that you don't quite measure up or that you're not perfect. The problem, the thing that disturbs your peace, is the shame within you that takes hold. You know, there was a time when people thought that shame was a good thing, right? Maybe you've seen in pictures of classrooms where someone gets in trouble, you stick the little cap on them and you put them in the corner and you shame them and you hope that that's going to change them. But what we know now is that there's no data. There is nothing that the realm of psychology, the scientific community, there is no data that shows that shame is helpful in any way for changing human behavior. It's damaging. It actually because it's an attack on the identity, it erodes the part of us that actually believes we can do better. It's way more likely to lead to things like substance abuse, alcoholism, mental and emotional disorders. It's damaging. It's damaging. And one of those places that has become known for approving, tolerating, and leveraging shame is the church. And that's why this has come up so many times. Because it's destructive, and yet somehow the church has developed a reputation for being a place where people are just gonna come and get beat up. We've literally had people ask, if I go to your church, am I gonna be shamed as soon as I walk in there? Right? I'm gonna walk in and I'm gonna get struck. I'm just gonna get struck by lightning the second I step on that property. There's this reputation that the church is out to get you. When it's the total opposite. It's the total opposite. And so you want to know how you know if you're like living in shame, especially if you're someone in the church. Like for me, I believed, especially when I first got into this whole idea of faith, I believed God wanted me to beat myself up. So like I'd blow it and be like, I'm just the worst. And I would like feel bad if I wasn't feeling shame. And so I would like live with it and live with it and live with it and live with it and then be like, all right, maybe I'll try again, right? And so I went into this cycle, and maybe you know this cycle. It's a cycle of like motivation, rededication, or motivation, condemnation, and rededication. It's like, all right, I'm gonna try really, really hard, and I failed. Now I'm gonna beat myself up for a couple days. Then enough time has passed, and let's get back into like all right, like, I'll rededicate I'll get it back. And then so we go back here, we're back at motivation. And it's just like, this was for years, this was my life. And I thought that's the way it was supposed to be. But it's damaging. It's harmful. There should be no place for shame in the church. And so often what happens is, yes, people are pushed away from church because of this whole idea of shame, or they're scared in to the church because of this whole idea of shame. Shamed in, pushed out, or shamed in. And there shouldn't be a place for shame in the church. And so maybe you're sitting there again, like I'm like a real question asker, right? And I'm like, okay, hold on a second. So what do we just say? Like, no, it's cool. You do whatever you want, right? Someone cuts you off in traffic, shoot them. And don't feel bad about it because we don't want shame, You would just go around doing whatever we want. It's probably worth noting that there's a huge difference between guilt and shame. When most of us say guilt, we usually are actually talking about shame. Guilt is very specific. Like you always know what guilt is telling you, right? So let's say there's a little girl walking down the street with ice cream, and I just walk by and smack the ice cream cone on the ground, right? I'm gonna feel guilty about that, and the guilt is going to be about me fixing what I did to her. It's gonna be very, very clear, like you should not have smacked her ice cream cone on the ground, and maybe you should go back and work for some reconciliation. Fix that, say you're sorry, buy her another ice cream cone, clear, right? Shame is, I'm gonna knock the ice cream cone over, and shame's gonna be like, what kind of person does something like that? It's an attack on the identity, not the action, right? Guilt speaks to the action, shame speaks to the identity. And so you're a horrible person. How are you supposed to be a pastor, right? And you like smack people's ice cream cones on the ground. And so I just turn in on myself and begin beating up myself. And she just goes on. And that's like another side of the destructive nature of shame. Shame makes my mistakes about me instead of about actually fixing what happened. And so when guilt comes in, guilt is clear, shame is vague. Guilt speaks to an action, shame speaks to an identity. Guilt always has a way out. It might not be easy. It might cause you to have to humble yourself and apologize, but there's a way out. There's a way toward reconciliation. Shame doesn't. Shame just beats you up forever. There's a huge difference between guilt and shame. There's a passage in a letter to a church in Ephesus, written by a guy named Paul. We've talked about him a lot, St. Paul, the Apostle Paul, right? And he kind of summarizes what the whole thing is about. The basis for our entire relationship with God, to God. And he uses the word grace. Grace. Grace is the solution to shame. In fact, when Paul's explaining it, he says it's like this. He says it like this. He says, for it's by grace that you've been saved. Now, if you've heard the word saved before, probably a bunch of different things come to mind. Maybe you're thinking about heaven, maybe you're thinking about a prayer, right? Saved, this is a theological catch-all word for God's helping relationship toward us, right? It could mean to redeem, to deliver, to rescue, to help, right? And so what Paul is saying here is that your relationship with God, your standing with God is 100% based on grace. Not like grace you pray before a meal, not grace like graceful, but grace like it is given and cannot be earned. You cannot earn it. It can only be accepted. And so he goes on, he explains a little bit. He says, you're saved by grace through faith, meaning you put your weight, You put your confidence in God's free gift to you through faith. And then he explains, he says, just to be clear, this is not from yourselves. It is a gift from God. Further clarification, not by works. In case you missed it, you can't work for it so that no one can boast. You couldn't brag about it if you wanted to because it's not something that you earned. It is a free gift. And then he explained it in more detail in a letter that he wrote to a church in Rome. He said that God demonstrates this radical free gift of grace, this radical free love for us, in that while we were at our worst, sinners, that's when Jesus gave everything for us. Not when we got it all together, not when we promised from here on out, I got this, but at our worst. He says that's when he died for us. In other words, if shame says I am flawed and therefore unworthy of being loved and accepted, grace says, yes, absolutely, I am flawed. But in spite of that, I am deeply loved and completely accepted. This is why this is such a big deal in church. Like, I genuinely believe we have the best answer to the issue of shame that everybody struggles with. And somehow we've turned this upside down, and the church has become known for a place that leverages shame instead of a place of grace that can actually deal with shame. When we begin to think in terms of grace, we're freed from the act that shame binds us to, right? That whole performing, pretending, defending. All of a sudden, I don't have to perform anymore because my worth is not based on what I do. It's not by works. And so when I listen to God, when I do what God says, it feels more like a response to his love than the requirement for his love. I don't have to pretend. I can be vulnerable. I can expose myself. I don't have to worry about what's going to happen if somebody sees the real me. Because it's my acceptance before God is not based on what I do. And I don't have to defend it. I can own my issues. When I mess up, I don't have, because it speaks to an action, not an identity. It doesn't say something about me. It's radical. It's transformative. And so my question for you is, especially if you're someone in the church, is your heart like motivated by grace or shame? When you hear someone say Jesus died for you, is it the feeling of a debt owed? Now I got to make up for that. Or is it the feeling of a debt paid? One is heavy. The other is light. One is a have to. The other is a get to. One is a requirement. The other is a response. One is grace, and one is shame. It's a free gift. Tim Keller is a pastor out in New York City. He's written a lot of books, really smart guy. He said, basically, and I've told you this before, he said the essence of our message, what we believe, what we call the gospel, literally our good news, he says that we are more flawed than we ever dared to believe. And yet, because of Jesus, we are more loved and accepted than we ever dared to hope. And that understanding that, it dissolves the grace, the faith, the shame within us. Takes care of the shame within us. I'm going to call the band up here and then we'll wrap up. But really, like what I want you to leave here with is just the ability to identify shame when you see it and when you hear it. Like I told you, there were years where I lived with it myself, where I felt like God wanted me to beat myself up. When you feel like beating yourself up, know that that's shame. And that's not something that God wants you to live with. Jesus came to take care of your shame, to free you from your shame, not to give you more of it. I'll leave you with this story. There's a show my wife and I just started watching. It's called Ted Lasso. It's about a football coach who goes to England, starts coaching soccer. And so you get to know all the players in the show. You start to fall in love with them, hear their stories, whatever. And there's this one scene I think is pretty powerful. There's this guy, his name's Roy. And he was the captain of the team. He was this superstar. And he's facing the reality of his declining career. He's getting older. And now he's got to go sit on the bench. And he can't handle that. And so he's talking to someone, and he's using the language of shame. He says, football, he means soccer, but he says, football is all I know. It's all I've ever done. He said, it's who I am. So he was unwilling to sit on the bench, to give it up. And then the person he's talking to does something I think is pretty brilliant. She calls over his niece, his 6-year-old niece, and she sits the little girl down. She says, I want you to close your eyes. Her name's Phoebe. Phoebe, close your eyes. Can you describe your Uncle Roy to me? And she says, well, she smiles. She says, well, he's my uncle. His beard is scratchy. He swears a lot. He buys me ice cream. He's really funny. She says, but he's my uncle, and I love him. She says nothing about soccer. And you could see this feeling of like peace just come over this guy, Roy. You know, I think for us today, we could take that a step further. Maybe for you right now, maybe you're struggling with shame. And maybe for you, the best thing you could do is hear what God has to say about you in light of your failures. Maybe you need to close your eyes and hear him say that you're his boy or his girl. And yeah, your mood is a little scratchy. You've got your issues. Maybe he would say they've got their problems, but I gave everything for them. You're mine, and I love you. When that sinks in, when we start thinking in terms of that kind of grace, the shame will melt away.